Julian Vance had signed contracts worth more money than some small countries made in a year. Tonight, he was scrubbing grease off a frying pan in the back of a small-town diner for $9 an hour. The hot water stung his hands. The smell of burnt oil clung to his clothes. A young waitress walked past without giving him a second look, never imagining that the quiet man standing by the sink had once been one of the richest businessmen in America. 6 months earlier, private jets waited for him on airport runways. Reporters chased him for interviews. Investors called him a visionary. His face appeared on magazine covers, and his signature could move billions of dollars with a single stroke of a pen. Now, his only job was making sure the dinner plates were clean before closing time. No one in that diner knew his real story. No one knew that in a single day, he had lost his billion-dollar empire, his reputation, and the woman he planned to spend the rest of his life with. His closest friend betrayed him. The woman he loved stood in front of millions of viewers on live television, slipped off her engagement ring, handed it to a reporter, and said through fake tears, "I never really knew the man at all." Those words hurt more than losing the company. The headlines called him a thief. The internet called him a fraud. The people who once begged for his attention acted as if he had never existed. So he disappeared. He drove until the city lights vanished behind him, until his car broke down outside a forgotten little town, where a small diner owner would offer him a free meal without asking for his name. She thought she was helping a broke stranger. She had no idea she was about to save a billionaire who had lost everything except the hope of starting over. Julian Vance had spent 15 years building a business that people said could never exist. He didn't inherit a fortune. He didn't come from old money. Everything he owned had been earned through sleepless nights, impossible risks, and an obsession with never giving up. By the age of 38, Vance Industries had become one of the largest logistics companies in America, moving billions of dollars worth of goods across the country every single week. Business magazines called him a genius. Young entrepreneurs studied his interviews like textbooks. But the people closest to Julian knew something the public didn't. Behind the expensive suits and the billion-dollar meetings was a man who still believed loyalty mattered more than money. Every morning, he arrived at headquarters before sunrise. He greeted the security guards by name. He remembered the birthdays of employees most executives would never notice. And every Friday afternoon, he walked through the office without cameras or assistants, shaking hands and asking people about their families. "Success means nothing if the people around you stop smiling," he once told a new manager. The employees loved him for it. The board respected him. The investors trusted him. And there was one man Julian trusted more than anyone else: Marcus Reed. The two had met in business school with nothing but ambition and borrowed textbooks. They dreamed of building a company together. When Vance Industries finally took off, Julian made Marcus his chief financial officer without hesitation. "If I ever have to choose between money and friendship," Julian once laughed during an interview, "I'll choose friendship every time." Marcus smiled when he heard those words. No one noticed that his smile never reached his eyes. At home, Julian believed he had found happiness too. His fiancée, Vanessa Cole, was beautiful, elegant, and always by his side whenever cameras were around. The tabloids called them America's power couple. Their wedding was only 4 months away. The invitations had already been designed. The venue had already been booked. Julian believed he was the luckiest man alive. He had no idea that while he was planning a future with the people he loved most, one of them was quietly planning to destroy him. And by the time he discovered the truth, it would already be too late. Julian trusted Marcus Reed with everything. For 15 years, they had built Vance Industries side by side. They celebrated every victory together, survived every financial crisis together, and promised that no amount of money would ever come between their friendship. Julian never imagined that the greatest threat to his empire was sitting in the office next to his. Late one evening, while most of the employees had already gone home, Marcus remained in his office, staring at a computer screen. A series of financial transfers flashed across the monitor. Millions of dollars quietly disappeared from company accounts and moved through a maze of shell companies that no ordinary audit would ever detect. Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Just a little longer," he whispered to himself, "then it will all be mine." At that same moment, Julian was downstairs in the lobby, talking with a cleaning lady whose son had just been accepted into college. When she apologized for interrupting his evening, Julian smiled and handed her his business card. "If he ever needs an internship, tell him to call me. Everyone deserves a chance." The woman thanked him with tears in her eyes. Upstairs, the man Julian trusted most was quietly destroying everything he had spent 15 years building. Over the next few weeks, forged approvals began appearing in company records. Fake signatures, hidden transactions, secret accounts. Every piece of evidence pointed toward one person: Julian Vance. Marcus carefully erased every trace of his own involvement until the trap was complete. One Friday afternoon, Julian walked into Marcus's office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I've been thinking," Julian said with a smile. "When all this expansion is finished, maybe it's time we slow down a little. We've spent half our lives building this company." Marcus forced a smile and accepted the coffee. "I couldn't agree more." Julian had no idea those would be some of the last honest words he would ever hear from the man he called his brother. Outside the office windows, the city sparkled under the evening sun. Inside, betrayal was already waiting. And within days, Julian's entire world would come crashing down. Julian arrived at headquarters expecting another ordinary Monday morning. Instead, he found security guards waiting outside the executive floor. The smiles that usually greeted him had vanished. Employees avoided eye contact as he walked past them, whispering under their breath. Confused, Julian stepped into the boardroom. Every seat was occupied. The directors sat in silence. Their lawyers were already present. Marcus sat near the end of the table with a worried expression that looked almost convincing. The chairman slowly pushed a thick folder across the table. "Julian, we've discovered unauthorized transfers totaling $40 million. Julian frowned. "What transfers?" "The ones approved under your name." Julian opened the file. Bank statements, approval forms, electronic signatures. Every page pointed directly at him. "This has to be a mistake," he said quietly. Marcus lowered his head and sighed. "I wanted to believe that too." The words hit Julian harder than any accusation. His oldest friend wasn't defending him. He was helping bury him. The chairman spoke again. "Until the investigation is complete, the board is asking you to step down as CEO." For a long moment, Julian couldn't move. He looked around the room, hoping someone would speak for him. No one did. The same people who had celebrated his success for years now looked at him like a stranger. He slowly stood up. Without saying another word, he picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, Marcus finally looked up. A faint smile crossed his face for only a second. No one else noticed it, but that single smile marked the beginning of Julian Vance's downfall. Julian had barely stepped out of the company building when his phone began ringing without pause. Journalists, television stations, business partners, friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He ignored every call. For the first time in his life, he had no answers. By afternoon, every major news channel was carrying the same headline: Billionaire CEO under investigation for corporate fraud. The story spread across social media within minutes. Comment sections exploded with accusations from people who had never met him. Some called him greedy. Others called him a criminal. Julian sat alone inside his car, staring at the screen on his dashboard as a live news broadcast appeared. The camera switched to the entrance of an expensive hotel where reporters crowded around Vanessa Cole. She looked elegant as always, dressed in white, but the smile Julian loved was gone. A reporter pushed a microphone toward her. "Miss Cole, do you still plan to marry Julian Vance?" Vanessa lowered her eyes and let out a slow breath. "I don't think I ever really knew the man I agreed to marry." The crowd fell silent. Then, in front of dozens of cameras, she slowly removed the diamond engagement ring from her finger. She held it for a moment before placing it into the reporter's hand. "If these accusations are true, I want nothing to do with him." Camera flashes lit up the street. Julian stared at the screen without blinking. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The company could be rebuilt. Money could be earned again. But hearing the woman he loved abandon him before the whole world broke something deep inside him. A single tear rolled down his face. He quietly switched off the screen, started the engine, and drove away without knowing where he was going. Behind him, the city continued moving as if his life had never mattered at all. Julian drove for hours without knowing where he was going. The city skyline slowly disappeared behind him, replaced by empty highways, quiet fields, and endless stretches of road that seemed to lead nowhere. His phone kept vibrating. His lawyers were calling. Board members were leaving messages. Television stations wanted interviews. He ignored every one of them. For the first time since building his company, Julian had no meeting to attend, no decision to make, and no one left who truly believed in him. As darkness settled over the highway, rain began to fall. The windshield wipers moved back and forth, while his thoughts grew heavier with every mile. He replayed Vanessa's words again and again. "I don't think I ever really knew the man I agreed to marry." Julian let out a quiet laugh that quickly turned into silence. "I guess you never did," he whispered to himself. Around midnight, the fuel gauge dropped lower. Then the engine coughed once, twice. Finally, the car rolled to a stop beside an old country road. Julian stepped outside and looked around. No skyscrapers, no cameras, no crowds, only silence. In the distance, a faded wooden sign stood beside the road. It read, "Welcome to Hartwell." Julian stared at it for a moment before picking up the small travel bag from his back seat. He had entered the town with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. He had no idea that this forgotten little place was about to change his life forever. The rain had stopped by the time Julian reached the edge of Hartwell. The little town looked as though time had forgotten it. There were no towering office buildings, no flashing billboards, and no reporters waiting with cameras. Just quiet streets, old brick buildings, and friendly faces going about ordinary lives. Julian walked slowly with a single travel bag over his shoulder. Everything he owned now could fit inside that bag. Only a few days earlier, he had walked through the headquarters of Vance Industries with hundreds of employees standing to greet him. Now, nobody looked at him twice. Strangely, that brought him a little peace. As he walked farther into town, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the cool evening air. His stomach tightened. He looked across the street and saw a small diner sitting on the corner beneath an old wooden sign, Pop's Diner. The paint had faded with age, but warm light spilled through the windows. People inside were laughing. For a moment, Julian simply stood there watching. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen people smiling without pretending. Finally, he pushed open the door. A tiny bell above the entrance chimed softly. The conversations inside continued without interruption. Nobody recognized him. Nobody whispered his name. To everyone inside, he was just another traveler looking for dinner. Behind the counter stood a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She looked up from pouring coffee. "Evening. Sit anywhere you'd like." Julian nodded quietly and took a seat near the window. Within minutes, she returned carrying a hot sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee. "You look like you've had a rough day." Julian looked at the food for a second before answering. "I've had a rough few months." She smiled gently. "Then you came to the right place." For the first time in days, Julian ate without thinking about courtrooms, television headlines, or betrayal. The food was simple. The coffee wasn't expensive, but somehow it tasted better than any meal money had ever bought. When he finished eating, he reached into his wallet and handed over his bank card. The payment machine beeped. Declined. Julian frowned and tried again. Another beep. Declined. He lowered his eyes in embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There must be a problem with the bank." The young woman looked at him for a moment before sliding the card back across the counter. "It's okay." Julian blinked. "I'll come back and pay tomorrow." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." He stared at her. "You don't even know me." She smiled. "I know you're hungry. Around here, that's enough." Her words caught him completely off guard. For months, everyone he met wanted something from him. This stranger wanted nothing at all. He whispered softly, "Thank you." Before he could stand, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Someone shouted. Another voice shouted back. Seconds later, a young cook stormed through the back door, pulled off his apron, threw it onto the floor, and walked out into the parking lot without looking back. The remaining staff exchanged worried looks. The young woman sighed and rubbed her forehead. "Well, there goes my dinner rush." Julian glanced toward the kitchen. "Did he quit?" She nodded. "My dishwasher left yesterday. Now my line cook just walked out." She laughed at her own bad luck. "I guess today just isn't my day." For a moment, they stood there in silence. Then she looked at Julian and smiled playfully. "You don't happen to know how to wash dishes, do you?" Julian almost laughed. Just a week ago, he had signed contracts worth billions of dollars. Now he was being asked if he could wash plates. He looked toward the kitchen before answering honestly, "No." Then he smiled for the first time in days. "But I can learn fast." The young woman laughed. "So can I." She reached out her hand. "I'm Maddie." He shook it. "Julian." No last name? Just Julian. She didn't ask another question. Instead, she pointed toward the kitchen. I can pay $9 an hour. It's not much, but if you're willing to work, you've got a job. Julian looked around the little diner one last time. His old life was gone. The boardrooms, the private jets, the luxury apartments. None of it mattered anymore. He looked back at Maddie. When do I start? She smiled. Right now. After closing time, Maddie led him upstairs to a tiny room above the diner. There was an old bed, a wooden chair, and a small window overlooking the quiet street below. It's not much, she said softly, but you can stay here until you figure things out. Julian placed his bag beside the bed and looked around the little room. For the first time since losing everything, he wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about Marcus. He wasn't thinking about Vanessa. He was simply grateful to have a roof over his head. As the lights downstairs went out and the town grew quiet, Julian sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the darkness. Tomorrow morning, the billionaire who once ruled an empire would wake up as a dishwasher. He had no idea that this little diner was about to give him something his billions never could. Julian's first day at Pop's Diner began before the sun came up. A gentle knock echoed through the tiny room above the diner. Julian, we're opening in 20 minutes. Maddie's voice came through the old wooden door. He opened his eyes and stared at the cracked ceiling above him. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then reality returned. The boardroom was gone. The penthouse was gone. The empire he had spent 15 years building was gone. Now he lived in a room barely big enough for a single bed and a wooden chair. He quietly got dressed and walked downstairs. The diner was already alive. Coffee was brewing. Bacon sizzled on the grill. The smell of fresh pancakes filled the kitchen, while waitresses hurried from table to table carrying plates. Julian stood near the sink, looking completely out of place. Maddie walked over and handed him a faded black apron. It belonged to the last dishwasher, she said with a smile. Try not to scare away the customers. Julian laughed softly. I'll do my best. The first hour was a disaster. Dirty plates arrived faster than he could wash them. Soap splashed across his shirt. Water soaked his sleeves. He stacked a pile of glasses too high and nearly dropped every one of them. One of the cooks shook his head and laughed. You've never worked in a kitchen before, have you? Julian smiled. Is it that obvious? The cook chuckled. I've seen toddlers wash dishes better than you. Even Julian couldn't help laughing. For the first time in weeks, the laughter around him didn't feel cruel. It felt warm. As the breakfast rush reached its busiest moment, Julian reached for a fryer basket that looked harmless. The metal handle burned his hand instantly. He pulled back. Ouch! Maddie hurried over. Without saying a word, she turned on the cold water and gently held his hand beneath the stream. You have soft hands, she teased. Julian smiled awkwardly. I guess I used to do a different kind of work. She looked at him curiously, but didn't ask another question. She simply smiled and returned to serving customers. That simple act of kindness stayed with Julian for the rest of the day. As the hours passed, he slowly found a rhythm. Wash, rinse, dry, stack, repeat. The work was exhausting, but strangely peaceful. Through the kitchen window, he watched the regular customers come and go. A retired couple shared breakfast at the same table they always used. 3 construction workers argued over football while finishing their coffee. After school, 2 young boys came in carrying nothing but a handful of quarters. They counted every coin carefully before ordering a basket of fries. Maddie smiled, added 2 slices of pie to their order, and whispered, "Don't worry about paying for dessert today." The boys grinned from ear to ear. Julian watched quietly. In the world he came from, people measured success by money. In this little diner, people measured it by kindness. No one asked about his past. No one cared about newspaper headlines. No one cared that he had once owned private jets or signed billion-dollar contracts. The only thing anyone cared about was whether the dishes were clean before the next customers walked in. As the diner finally grew quiet that evening, Julian wiped his hands on his apron and looked around the kitchen. His back hurt. His feet ached. His hands were sore from hot water and soap. Yet something inside him felt lighter than it had in months. For the first time since losing everything, Julian found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The days slowly turned into weeks. At first, Julian counted every sunrise, telling himself he would leave Hartwell as soon as his life returned to normal. But somewhere between the breakfast rush and the dinner crowd, something inside him began to change. Every morning, Maddie unlocked the front door before dawn. Every morning, Julian was already downstairs, waiting with his apron tied and the coffee machine warming up. The kitchen staff no longer laughed when they saw him. Instead, they joked that the former city boy was finally learning how to survive in a real kitchen. Julian laughed with them. He had stopped pretending to be someone else. He was simply Julian. One quiet afternoon after lunch, the diner emptied earlier than usual. Maddie sat behind the counter surrounded by receipts, invoices, and unpaid bills. She rubbed her forehead and sighed. "I swear these numbers get worse every month." Julian looked over from the sink. "Need another pair of eyes." She slid the papers across the counter. "If you can make sense of this mess, be my guest." Julian studied the books for only a few minutes. He noticed duplicate supplier charges, unnecessary expenses, and inventory orders that could easily be reduced. Without saying much, he grabbed a pen and quietly reorganized the figures. When he finished, he pushed the notebook back toward Maddie. She stared at the pages in disbelief. "How did you do that?" Julian shrugged. "I used to work with numbers." She laughed. "You definitely undersold yourself." For the next hour, the two of them sat side by side, balancing receipts and talking about everything except the past. Maddie spoke about her father, who had built Pop's Diner with his own hands before illness took him away. She admitted she had been fighting the bank for years just to keep the place open. Julian listened carefully. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about his own pain. He was thinking about someone else's. Later that evening, the old walk-in refrigerator stopped working. The kitchen filled with worried voices. "If we lose this food, we're finished," one employee muttered. Julian rolled up his sleeves and crouched beside the old machine. After nearly an hour of checking loose wires and dusty connections, the refrigerator suddenly hummed back to life. The entire kitchen erupted in cheers. Maddie looked at him with surprise. "You fix refrigerators too?" Julian smiled. "I watched enough repair people over the years." She shook her head and laughed. "Who exactly are you, Julian?" For a brief second, his smile faded. "I wish I knew." That night, after the diner closed, the two of them sat outside on the back steps, sharing slices of leftover apple pie. Neither of them spoke very much. They simply watched the stars appear over Hartwell. For the first time since losing everything, Julian realized he wasn't counting what he had lost anymore. He was quietly beginning to appreciate what he had found. Julian and Maddie remained on the back steps, long after the last slice of apple pie had disappeared. The night was quiet. The lights inside Pop's diner had been switched off, leaving only the small porch light above them casting a soft glow across the empty parking lot. Neither of them seemed ready to go inside. For the first time in months, Julian wasn't thinking about lawyers, board meetings, or newspaper headlines. He was simply enjoying the peace. Maddie looked toward the dark street ahead and smiled. "You know, my dad used to say this diner had a way of fixing broken people." Julian turned toward her. "Did it work?" She laughed quietly. "Sometimes." Her smile slowly faded. "I think it fixed me after I lost him." Julian lowered his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt comfortable. It wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding. The next few weeks passed quietly. Every morning, they opened the diner together. Every evening, they closed it together. Some days were busy. Some days were slow. But somewhere between washing dishes, balancing receipts, and serving coffee to the regular customers, their friendship grew into something neither of them could explain. The kitchen staff noticed it first. One afternoon, while Julian was drying plates, one of the cooks leaned over and whispered, "You know she smiles a lot more when you're around." Julian laughed and shook his head. "You're imagining things." The cook grinned. "No, son, you're the one who's imagining things." Julian tried to ignore the comment, but later that evening, as he watched Maddie laughing with an elderly customer, he realized the cook might have been right. She had become the brightest part of his day. After closing time, they locked the front door and walked slowly around the quiet streets of Hartwell. The town had already gone to sleep. The only sound came from the wind moving through the trees. Maddie stopped beside the old bridge that crossed the small river outside town. She leaned against the railing and looked at the water below. "Can I ask you something?" Julian nodded. "What are you running from?" The question caught him completely off guard. He looked down at the river. Images rushed through his mind. Marcus, the boardroom, the television cameras, Vanessa taking off the engagement ring, the company he had spent 15 years building, his entire life disappearing in a single afternoon. He took a slow breath. For a second, he wanted to tell Maddie everything. He wanted to tell her his real name. He wanted to tell her about the betrayal. He wanted to tell her why he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night unable to sleep. But something stopped him. Not because he didn't trust her. He trusted her more than anyone else. The truth was simpler than that. For the first time since his world fell apart, he wasn't Julian Vance, billionaire CEO. He was simply Julian, a man standing beside a woman who cared about him without knowing what he owned or what he had lost. He wasn't ready to lose that. He looked at her and smiled sadly. "It's a long story." Maddie waited. "And it's not a good one." She looked into his eyes for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Then I won't ask again." Julian looked surprised. She smiled softly. "When you're ready to tell me, I'll be here." Those simple words touched him more deeply than she could ever know. No conditions, no pressure, no judgment. Just patience. Without thinking, Julian reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally. They stood there beneath the stars for what felt like forever. Then Julian took a small step closer. Maddie looked up at him. Their eyes met. Slowly, gently, they kissed. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, just two lonely hearts finding comfort in each other. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them spoke. They simply smiled. And somewhere deep inside Julian, a broken part of his heart began to heal. Neither of them knew that their quiet happiness was about to be interrupted by a past that refused to stay buried. The next morning began like every other morning at Pop's diner. The coffee was already brewing before sunrise. Construction workers filled the front booths. The same elderly couple sat by the window sharing pancakes. Children stopped by before school to grab muffins for the bus ride. Julian moved quietly between the kitchen and the sink, washing dishes while humming softly to himself. Life had become simple, and for the first time in a long time, simple was enough. Around noon, a delivery truck pulled into the parking lot. The driver climbed down carrying boxes of vegetables and fresh bread for the diner. His name was Hank Doyle. He delivered supplies to dozens of small towns every week and had stopped at Pop's hundreds of times over the years. Maddie greeted him with a smile. "You're late today." Hank laughed. "Traffic." He signed the delivery receipt and stepped inside to grab a cup of coffee before heading back out. As he waited at the counter, his eyes wandered toward the kitchen. Julian was standing at the sink with his sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a frying pan. For a second, Hank froze. The coffee cup slipped slightly from his hand. He stared at Julian without saying a word. Julian looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Hank didn't answer. Instead, he took one slow step closer. "I know you." Julian's smile disappeared. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Hank looked at him again, searching his memory. Then his eyes widened. "You're that billionaire from the news." Every sound inside the diner seemed to stop. The cook stopped moving. One waitress turned around. Even the customers nearest the counter looked up. Julian lowered his eyes. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Maddie looked from Hank to Julian, confused by the silence. What is he talking about? Julian took a slow breath. There was no point pretending anymore. "My name isn't just Julian." His voice was calm. "It's Julian Vance." The words seemed to hang in the air. Maddie stared at him in disbelief. "The Julian Vance?" He nodded quietly. "The one they accused on television?" Another slow nod. Maddie stepped back without realizing it. "You knew this whole time?" Julian looked at the floor. "I wanted to tell you." "Then why didn't you?" He struggled to find the words. "Because this is the first place I've been where people treated me like a person instead of a headline." The diner fell silent again. No one knew what to say. Hank looked embarrassed. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Julian forced a small smile. "It's all right." But deep inside, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. By evening, whispers had already spread across Hartwell. People talked outside the grocery store. They talked at the gas station. They talked inside the barber shop. The story traveled faster than the wind. And hundreds of miles away, in a luxury office tower, a phone began to ring. The voice on the other end spoke only one sentence. "We found Julian." Marcus Reed slowly stood from his chair. A cold smile crossed his face. "So, our dishwasher finally wants to come home." Far away in Hartwell, Julian stood outside Pop's diner, watching the sunset. He had no idea that the quiet little life he had built was about to be tested once again. By the following afternoon, Pop's diner was no longer the quiet little restaurant it had always been. 2 television vans were parked across the street. Photographers stood outside pretending to order coffee while secretly hoping for a picture. Curious townspeople gathered on the sidewalk, whispering to one another. Inside the diner, the atmosphere felt tense. Julian continued washing dishes as though nothing had changed, but everyone could see the weight on his face. Maddie walked over and quietly stood beside him. "You could leave for a few days." Julian shook his head. "I've spent too much of my life running. I'm not running anymore." Before Maddie could answer, the bell above the front door rang. The entire diner fell silent. A woman wearing an elegant cream-colored designer coat stepped inside, followed by a tall man in an expensive black suit. Vanessa Cole. Marcus Reed. For a moment, nobody moved. Vanessa slowly looked around the little diner, her eyes settling on Julian, standing behind the sink with his sleeves rolled up. Disbelief crossed her face. "This is where you've been." Julian said nothing. Marcus forced a friendly smile and walked forward. "Julian, we've been worried about you." The words sounded rehearsed. The kitchen staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. Julian calmly dried his hands with a towel before turning toward them. "Worried?" Marcus nodded. "The board wants to help. They think you've been through enough." Vanessa stepped closer. "You don't belong here." She looked around the diner with quiet disgust. "You belong back in your office." Julian looked at the sink full of dishes before answering. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be." Vanessa frowned. "Look at yourself. You used to own private jets. Now you're washing plates." Her words echoed through the diner. Before Julian could respond, Maddie stepped forward. She stood between them without hesitation. "He isn't just washing plates. He's helping people. He's working honestly. And he's done more good in this town in 3 months than some people do in a lifetime." Vanessa looked at her with surprise. "And you are?" Maddie met her eyes without fear. "I'm the woman who gave him a meal when the rest of the world threw him away." The diner became completely silent. Even Marcus looked uncomfortable. For the first time since arriving, Julian smiled. Not because he had won an argument, but because someone had chosen to stand beside him when they had nothing to gain. Marcus quickly changed the subject. "Julian, let's talk privately. It's about your remaining company shares." Julian's expression changed. For the first time that afternoon, a look of suspicion crossed his face. He remembered the missing money, the forged documents, the signatures he never approved. He looked directly at Marcus. "What exactly do you want me to sign?" Marcus hesitated for only a second. But that single second told Julian everything. Somewhere behind Marcus's polished smile, fear had begun to grow. And Julian suddenly realized that the men who had destroyed his life might not be as untouchable as they believed. The silence inside Pop's diners seemed to stretch forever. Marcus forced another smile, but it looked weaker than before. "Julian," he said calmly, "there's no reason to make this difficult. The board simply wants to move forward. If you sign over your remaining shares, everyone can finally put this unfortunate situation behind them." Julian folded the kitchen towel in his hands and placed it neatly on the counter. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "You drove 4 hours to a small town just to ask for my shares." Marcus hesitated. Vanessa answered before he could. "You're not using them anyway." She looked around the diner with quiet disbelief. "You've traded boardrooms for dirty dishes." Julian smiled faintly. "And somehow I'm sleeping better." A few customers quietly laughed. Vanessa's expression hardened. "This isn't the life you were meant to have." Julian looked around the diner. The cooks, the regular customers, Maddie standing beside the coffee machine, the little restaurant that had given him hope when he had none left. No, he replied softly. It's the life I needed. Marcus stepped closer and lowered his voice. Julian, be reasonable. You've already lost enough. Don't lose what's left. Julian looked at him for a long moment. Then he quietly reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He placed it on the counter between them. Marcus stared at it. His smile disappeared. Do you know what this is? Julian asked. Marcus said nothing. It's 2 years of vendor records. Wire transfers. Approval logs. Hidden accounts. The kind of records nobody thought to check. Vanessa looked from Julian to Marcus in confusion. Julian continued calmly. After I came to Hartwell, I finally had something I hadn't had in years. Time. So every night after closing, while everyone else was asleep, I went through every old file I could still access. I followed every transfer, every invoice, every missing dollar. His voice never rose. I found the truth. Marcus's face turned pale. For the first time since entering the diner, fear replaced confidence. You're bluffing. Julian shook his head. No. I already sent copies to a forensic accountant and 2 members of the board this morning. The entire diner fell silent. Vanessa slowly turned toward Marcus. What is he talking about? Marcus looked away. Julian took 1 step forward. You spent 2 years stealing from the company. And you spent 2 years making sure every trail pointed to me. The words landed like thunder. Nobody inside the diner moved. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since Julian lost everything, the man who had destroyed his life looked truly afraid. Outside, television cameras continued waiting across the street. Inside Pop's diner, the truth had finally begun to surface. And by tomorrow morning, nothing in Marcus Reed's world would ever be the same again. The following morning, the story spread across the country faster than anyone expected. The forensic accountant hired by the board spent the entire night reviewing the files Julian had uncovered. Every wire transfer, every hidden account, every forged approval. Piece by piece, the truth came into focus. By sunrise, there was no longer any doubt. The missing money had never been Julian's crime. It had been Marcus Reed's. An emergency meeting of the board was called before the stock market opened. For the first time since the scandal began, Julian's lawyers were invited back into the room. Marcus arrived wearing the same expensive suit and confident smile he always wore. He expected another routine meeting. Instead, every director was staring at him. The chairman slowly pushed a folder across the table. Inside were the financial records Julian had uncovered. Marcus flipped through the pages. His hands began to shake. The room remained silent. No one defended him. No one spoke on his behalf. The same silence that had once surrounded Julian now surrounded Marcus. Finally, the chairman broke it. You're suspended immediately. Security officers entered the room. Marcus looked around desperately. His eyes searched for someone to stand beside him. No one moved. As he was escorted toward the door, he turned back one last time. This isn't over. But his voice no longer carried confidence, only fear. Within hours, every major news network changed its headlines. The man once accused of stealing from his own company had been cleared. The real architect of the fraud had finally been exposed. Across the country, people who had judged Julian without knowing the truth suddenly changed their opinions. The same television stations that once questioned his integrity now called him a victim of betrayal. Meanwhile, Vanessa's world began to collapse. Luxury brands quietly ended their partnerships with her. Television interviews were canceled. Magazine covers disappeared. Sponsors who once celebrated her elegance no longer returned her calls. Social media turned against her overnight. People remembered how quickly she had abandoned the man she claimed to love. The life she had built on public admiration began to disappear one headline at a time. Back in Hartwell, Julian knew almost nothing about it. He was standing behind the sink at Pop's diner, rinsing coffee cups as the breakfast rush slowed. Maddie walked over holding her phone. She looked at the screen, then at Julian. They know the truth now. Julian dried his hands with a towel. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he quietly looked around the little diner. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Customers laughed over breakfast. Someone dropped a spoon and everyone chuckled. He smiled softly. For months he had dreamed of clearing his name. Now that it had finally happened, he realized something unexpected. The greatest thing he had found wasn't justice. It was the quiet little life that had found him when he had nothing left. But outside the diner, a black luxury car was already driving toward Hartwell. Inside sat Vanessa Cole, and for the first time in her life, she was coming not to leave Julian behind, but to beg him for one more chance. The black sedan rolled quietly into Hartwell just after sunrise. It slowed as it passed the grocery store, the old church, and finally stopped across the street from Pop's diner. Vanessa Cole stepped out and looked at the little restaurant. Only a few months earlier, she had stood before millions of television viewers and thrown away the engagement ring of the man she claimed to love. Now she stood outside a diner, hoping that man would give her one more chance. Inside, the breakfast rush had just ended. Julian was wiping down the counter while Maddie counted the register. The bell above the front door rang. Julian looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Vanessa looked different. The expensive confidence she once carried had disappeared. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and the smile she tried to force quickly faded. "I've been looking for you." Julian remained calm. "You found me." She glanced around the diner before looking back at him. "I've made mistakes." "I know that now." Julian said nothing. Vanessa took another step forward. "When everyone turned against you, I was scared. I listened to the headlines. I listened to everyone except the one person I should have believed." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry." The entire diner had fallen silent. Even the cook stopped working. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. Vanessa reached into her handbag and slowly removed the engagement ring she had once handed to a reporter on live television. She placed it gently on the counter. "I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air. Julian looked at the ring for several seconds before quietly pushing it back toward her. His voice was calm, but every word carried years of pain. "The woman I loved believed the headlines before she believed me." Vanessa lowered her head. Julian looked toward Maddie, who was standing quietly a few feet away. Then he looked back at Vanessa. "But the woman standing over there believed in me before she even knew who I was." A tear rolled down Vanessa's cheek. Julian continued. "When I lost my company, I thought I had lost everything. But losing everything showed me who was willing to stay when there was nothing left to gain. I don't hate you, Vanessa. I truly hope you find happiness. But my future isn't behind me anymore. It's standing right here." He gently reached for Maddie's hand. She looked at him with quiet emotion and held it tightly. The entire diner remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Vanessa wiped away her tears. She looked at Julian one last time. Then she picked up the ring, turned around, and slowly walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped. Without looking back, she whispered, "I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." The bell above the door rang softly as she disappeared outside. Julian watched the door close. Then he looked at Maddie. She smiled through tears. Without saying a word, she rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time since his world fell apart, Julian knew with complete certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. Outside, the morning sun rose over Hartwell, quietly closing one chapter of his life and opening another. Spring arrived in Hartwell with warm sunshine and blooming flowers. Life had changed in ways Julian could never have imagined. The board of Vance Industries asked him to return as chief executive officer, promising to restore everything he had lost. Julian accepted, but only on one condition. He would divide his time between the corporate headquarters and Hartwell. He refused to leave behind the little town that had given him hope when the rest of the world had turned its back on him. Before the bank could begin foreclosure proceedings, Julian quietly paid every outstanding loan on Pop's Diner. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He placed the deed into Maddie's hands. She looked at the papers in disbelief. "You bought the diner." Julian smiled. "I made sure no one will ever take it away from you again." Tears filled her eyes. "You can't solve everything with money." Julian laughed softly. "I know. I'm not trying to buy the diner. I'm protecting the place that saved my life." Maddie looked at him for a long moment. "And what about us?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This time, there were no television cameras, no reporters, no billion-dollar contracts. Only two people standing inside the little diner that had changed both their lives. He opened the box. Inside was a simple diamond ring. Julian smiled. "This one isn't for the newspapers. It's for forever." Maddie covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Before she could answer, the entire diner staff and regular customers, who had secretly been watching from the kitchen, burst into applause. The whole room filled with laughter. A few months later, the town gathered behind Pop's Diner for the wedding. White folding chairs lined the grass. Fresh flowers decorated the little garden. Children ran between the tables while neighbors laughed and shared homemade food. Hank Doyle arrived still wearing his delivery uniform because he had come straight from work. Nobody cared. It made everyone smile. When Maddie walked down the aisle, Julian could hardly believe how much his life had changed. The man who had once measured success by money now measured it by moments like this. As the sun began to set, they exchanged vows surrounded by the people who had become family. Months later, despite once again leading a billion-dollar company, Julian still visited Pop's Diner whenever he came back to Hartwell. One quiet morning before opening, he walked into the kitchen wearing the same black apron he had worn on his first day. He picked up a single coffee cup and quietly washed it. Maddie smiled from the doorway. "You know, nobody expects the CEO to wash dishes anymore." Julian looked at the cup in his hands before placing it on the drying rack. Then he smiled. "I don't wash dishes because I have to. I wash them because I never want to forget the woman who believed in me when I had nothing." Maddie walked over and slipped her hand into his. Together, they looked around the little diner. The morning sunlight poured through the windows. The coffee was brewing. The first customers were already walking toward the front door. And Julian realized that losing everything had been the greatest gift life had ever given him. because it led him to the one place where he finally found everything that truly mattered. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. I poured my heart into writing an exclusive ebook filled with 5 unforgettable billionaire love stories. Stories of betrayal, second chances, impossible romance, heartbreak, and endings that will stay with you long after you finish reading. If you enjoyed Julian and Maddie's journey, you'll fall in love with the stories waiting inside. Grab your copy through the link in the description or pinned comment and continue the journey today. And if this story made you smile, cry, or believe in love again, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because someone else out there might need this story too.